everybody posed on Lookout Mountain.
All the Western heroes were there from Forrest on down. It's a great battle.
At 8 a.m. on the morning of September 18th, Nathan Bedford Forrest's cavalry ran into a brigade of Federals, heading for a little bridge over the creek. By noon, one of Forrest's officers reported the dead were piled upon each other like cordwood to make passage for advancing columns. By nightfall, both lines held. On the second day of fierce fighting, Rosecrans committed a fatal mistake, ordering his troops to close a gap in the Union line that wasn't there. In the process, he opened up a real one, and Longstreet's Confederates stormed through.
The regiment we fought and captured was a 15th Alabama. They said they never were whipped before and never wanted to meet the 20th of Maine again. Corporal William T. Livermore.
On the slopes of Little Round Top, farmers from Talladega, Alabama had fought fishermen from Presque Isle, Maine. The two towns were each 650 miles from Gettysburg, which lay almost exactly on a direct line between them. Throughout the day's fighting, Colonel A.S. Fremantle, a British observer traveling with Lee, was surprised to hear the sound of a Confederate band playing polkas and waltzes amidst the hissing and bursting of the shells. But far out in front of the Union lines, General Sickles and his men were in desperate trouble. The rebels were closing in from three sides. Confederate shells tore branches from the peach trees and bounded among the men.
The hoarse and indistinguishable orders of commanding officers, the screaming and bursting of shells, canister and shrapnel as they tore through the struggling masses of humanity, the death screams of wounded animals, the groans of their human companions, wounded and dying and trampling underfoot by hurrying batteries, riderless horses in the moving lines of battle. A perfect hell on earth, never perhaps to be equaled, certainly not to be surpassed, nor ever to be forgotten in a man's lifetime. It has never been effaced from my memory day or night for 50 years. Private Robert H. Carter, 22nd Massachusetts.
The balls were whizzing so thick, a Texan remembered that it looked like a man could hold out a hat and catch it full.
Of stone struck some men down in every direction. About 30 men of our brigade were killed or wounded. Elijah Hunt Rhodes.
To keep up his men's courage, General Winfield Scott Hancock rode up and down the line without flinching at the screaming shells. A brigadier urged him to take cover. Hancock refused. There are times, he answered, when a corps commander's life does not count. Union artillery began to fire back.
We sat and heard in silence. What other expression had we that was not mean for such an awful universe of battle? All in the rear of the crest for 1,000 yards was the field of the shell's blind fury. Ambulances passing down the Tarrytown Road with wounded men were struck. The hospitals were riddled. Frank Haskell.
Suddenly, the Union guns fell silent to conserve ammunition for the attack Meade was sure was coming, and to lure the enemy out into the open fields. It worked. At about 2 o'clock, Pickett asked if his men should go forward. Longstreet, convinced the charge was folly, unable to bring himself to speak, only nodded.
If you stop to think about it, it would have been much harder not to go than to go. It would have taken a great deal of courage to say, Marse Robert, I ain't going. Nobody's got that much courage.
Now Pickett gave the order. Up, men, and to your posts. Don't forget today that you are from Old Virginia. At 3 o'clock, 3 divisions, 13,000 men, started out of the woods toward the stone wall a mile and a half away at a brisk, steady pace, covering about 100 yards a minute. They were silent as they marched, forbidden this time to fire or even to give the rebel yell until they were on top of the enemy.
More than half a mile their front extends, man touching man, rank pressing rank. The red flags wave, their horsemen gallop up and down. The arms of 13,000 men, barrel and bayonet, gleam in the sun. A sloping forest of flashing steel. Right on they move, as with one soul. None on that crest now need be told. The enemy is advancing. Every eye could see his legions, an overwhelming, resistless tide, an ocean of armed men sweeping upon us. All was orderly and still upon our crest, no noise and no confusion. General Gibbon rode down the lines, cool and calm, and in an unimpassioned voice, he said to the men, "Do not hurry, men, and fire too fast. Let them come up close before you fire, and then aim slow."
It was, a Union colonel recalled, the most beautiful thing I ever saw. Suddenly, the Union artillery on Cemetery Ridge and Little Round Top opened fire, and a great moan went up from the Confederate line. We could not help hitting them at every shot, a Federal officer recalled. As many as 10 men at a time were destroyed by a single bursting shell. A Confederate lieutenant cried out to his men, "Home, boys, home. Remember, home is over beyond those hills." The waiting Union troops began chanting, "Fredericksburg, Fredericksburg, Fredericksburg." When the first Southerners came within 200 yards, Union General Alexander Hayes told his men to fire. 11 cannon and 1,700 muskets, south 28,000. The 2,400 inhabitants of Gettysburg now had 10 times that number of dead and wounded men to care for.
Wounded men were brought into our houses and laid side by side in our halls and first-story rooms. Carpets were so saturated with blood as to be unfit for further use. Walls were blood-stained, as well as books that were used for pillows. Jenny McCreary.
The Confederacy could not afford such sacrifices. All hope of invading the North was ended. The next day, Lee began the long retreat back to Virginia as a summer downpour washed the blood from the grass and pelted the wounded who rode in a wagon train that stretched 17 miles.
July 4. Was ever the nation's birthday celebrated in such a way before? I wonder what the South thinks of us Yankees now. I think Gettysburg will cure the rebels of any desire to invade the North again. Elijah Hunt Rhodes.
Despite urgings from Washington, Meade refused to attack Lee's retreating army. Another opportunity to destroy the Army of Northern Virginia was lost. Once again, Lincoln was furious. Meanwhile, Robert E. Lee wrote Jefferson Davis offering to resign.
Dear President Davis, I cannot even accomplish what I myself desire. How can I fill the expectations of others? I generally feel a begrowing failure of my bodily strength. I anxiously urge the matter upon your excellency from my belief that a younger and abler man than myself can readily be obtained. Robert E. Lee.
The offer was not accepted.
William Faulkner in Intruder in the Dust says that for every Southern boy, it's always in his reach to imagine it being 1 o'clock in an early July day in 1863. The guns are laid, the troops are lined up, the flags are already out of their cases and ready to be unfurled, but it hadn't happened yet. And he can go back to the time before the war was going to be lost, and he can always have that moment for himself.
Hospital near Gettysburg. My dear Father, it has pleased the God of battles that I should number among the many wounded. Through his infinite kindness and mercy, I am permitted to inform you that I have recovered. I was wounded in 2 places. First, through the hip. Second, the ball entered the inner corner of my left eye and came out at the lower tip of my right ear. Both are doing fine and healed up. Write to me. I may get the letter. Your devoted son, Albert Batchelor.
After Gettysburg, the residents of Deer Isle, Maine began scanning the casualty list for familiar names. 2 privates, John Gray and Isaiah Eaton, were badly wounded and soon died in hospitals. Both were buried in the new National Cemetery at Gettysburg. The streets grew quiet when news of Gettysburg reached Clarksville, Tennessee. The 14th Tennessee Regiment had left town 2 years before with 960 men. When the Battle of Gettysburg began, only 365 remained. By the end of the first day, there were 60 men left. By the end of the battle, there were only 3.
A gloom rests over the city. The hopes and affections of the people were wrapped in the regiment. What a terrible responsibility rests upon.
Look uneasy and by no means exultant. I fear we are too hopeful. We shall see tomorrow. Sally Broadhead.
As the sun set, the Union left and right still held. Lee was sure an all-out Confederate attack on the center the next day would work.
When the second day's battle was over, General Lee pronounced it a success. But we had accomplished little toward victorious results. General James Longstreet.
The first day's fighting was so encouraging. And the second day's fighting, he came within an inch of doing it. And by that time, Longstreet said Lee's blood was up. And Longstreet said when his blood was up, there was no stopping him. Longstreet tried to stop him. And Lee said, no, he's there, I'm in the enemy, and I'm going to strike him.
General Longstreet, I think, had good reasons to worry about attacking the Union position at Gettysburg. After all, it was his corps at Fredericksburg that mowed down the Union troops in front of the stone wall. He could realize what the rifled musket could do, held in the hands of determined troops.
The next day was Pickett's charge.
Lee, by the summer of 1863, had come to believe that he was invincible, and so was the Army of Northern Virginia. The record would almost invite that when you see how they had pummeled one Union general after another and had defeated, or at least fought to a draw, the Army of the Potomac almost in every battle up to that point. And Lee really did think that if he asked his boys to do something, they would do it, that they would do anything. He had come by Gettysburg then to believe in his invincibility and that of his men, and it was his doom.
The third day began badly for Lee. Ewell's men were driven back from Culp's Hill. Jeb Stuart was supposed to get behind the Federals and attack them from the rear. But Union cavalry stopped and held him, thanks in part to a series of reckless charges led by 23-year-old General George Armstrong Custer. Everything now depends.
Many of the enemy's first line threw down their arms and surrendered. An officer fired his pistol at my head with one hand, while he handed me his sword with the other.
The Confederates had gone only a few paces when from their left came a second horrifying surprise. Chamberlain's missing Company B, which had found protection behind a stone wall, now rose and fired.
His right-hand comrade was shot in the side or back. Some were struck simultaneously from 2 or 3 balls from different directions. Colonel William C. Oates.
Oates' men wavered, broke, and ran for their lives.
My dead and wounded were then nearly as great in number as those still on duty. They literally covered the ground. The blood stood in puddles in some places on the rocks. The ground was soaked with blood.
Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain's scanty force captured 400 Confederates. Little Round Top held.
John Williams, South Carolina, killed at Missionary Ridge, Tennessee, November 1863.
Under Grant's leadership, the Union Army had broken the Confederate siege at Chattanooga. It was another triumph for Grant. It was a great victory, Sherman said, the neatest and cleanest battle I was ever in, and Grant deserves the credit of it all. In the weeks that followed, everybody posed on Lookout Mountain. General Thomas ordered a Union cemetery laid out on a hill called Orchard Knob that had seen savage fighting. A chaplain asked if the burials should be by state. "No, no, mix 'em up," Thomas said. "I'm tired of states' rights." At the Capitol in Washington at noon on December 2nd, 1863, a 19-foot bronze goddess of freedom triumphant was at last hoisted into place. The great dome was finished.
I like to stand aside and look a long, long while up at the dome. It comforts me somehow. Walt Whitman.
In camp, December 3rd, 1863. It is now just 21 days till Christmas. I would give anything if I could be there to take Christmas with you. Martha, if you get this letter and have any chance, I wish you would send me an old woolen quilt, for I've not got any blankets and we can't get any, so I fare bad of a cold night. Benjamin Franklin Jackson.
Christmas Day, 1863. General Buckner had seen a Yankee pictorial. Angels were sent down from heaven to bear up Stonewall's soul. They could not find it, flew back sorrowing. When they got to the Golden Gates above, they found Stonewall, by a rapid flank movement, had already cut his way in. Mary Chestnut.
This year has brought about many changes that at the beginning would have been thought impossible. The close of the year finds me a soldier for the cause of my race. May God bless the cause and enable me in the coming year to forward it on. Christian Fleetwood.
It was an extremely religious age. Both sides wanted to get right with God. John Brown said he was an instrument in the hands of God to bring him to Harper's Ferry to free the slaves and perhaps begin the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln finally felt that he too was an instrument in the hand of God and that God was punishing the country for the crime of slavery. Robert E. Lee said that he was an instrument in the hands of God and said at Gettysburg that it's all in God's hands, and then sent the cream of his army to its doom. They really felt that providence was at work in this war. As Lincoln said, we both prayed to the same God, we both invoked him, we both said we were on his side, but it wasn't until 1863, and indeed at the end of the war, that it became clear where God's judgment was coming down. That was on the whole country. It must now atone in blood for its complicity in wickedness, the wickedness of slavery.
The Civil War was fought in 10,000 places, at Big Bend, Big Sandy, and the Big Sunflower River. From Bunker Hill, West Virginia, and Blue Springs, Tennessee, and Cairo, Illinois, to Golgotha Church, Georgia, and Christiansburg, Kentucky. At Citrus Point on the Cimarron River, and along Cowskin Bottom. At Pebbly Run and La Glorieta Pass, and Gettysburg.
I think if I had my choice of all the moments to be present at in that war period, it would be at Gettysburg during Lincoln's delivery of his speech. Maybe to have seen him craft those beautiful words, his marvelous healing words, and then deliver them. They were for everyone for all time. They subsumed the entire war and all in it. It showed his compassion for everyone, his love for his people. That's where I'd like to be.
On November 19th, Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg to dedicate the new Union Cemetery. The featured speaker was Edward Everett of Massachusetts, a diplomat, clergyman, and celebrated orator. The president had been invited almost as an afterthought to offer a few appropriate remarks. Everett spoke for not quite 2 hours. Then Lincoln rose. A local photographer took his time focusing. Presumably, the president could be counted on to go on for a while. But he spoke just 269 words. He started off by reminding his audience that just 87 years had passed since the founding of the nation. And then he went on to embolden the Union cause with some of the most stirring words ever spoken. Lincoln was heading back to his seat before the photographer could open the shutter.
He felt that he had failed, that it was a poor speech, that the people didn't like it. It was so brief, less than 2 minutes. He felt that he had failed. Lehman, his friend Ward Lehman, was sitting next to him on the stand. When he sat down, there was just a sprinkling of applause. And he said, "Lehman, that speech won't scowl. That's what you say about a plow in the prairies when the mud doesn't come off it."
The cheek of every American must tingle with shame as he reads the silly, flat, dishwatery utterances of the man who has to be pointed out to intelligent foreigners as the President of the United States. Chicago Times.
Dear Mr. President, I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes. Edward Everett.
Fourscore-and-7 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met here on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of it as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that their nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they have thus far so nobly carried on. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they here gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.